Hello all, we will be solving June 2016 paper 1 weighed in 2 for O-level economics. The first question says what economic concept must be at work when there is a movement by a country along its PPC or production possibility curve? Well, quick recap of what a PPC is. A PPC is a curve that shows you what we say the maximum output a country can make of two goods, let's say good X and good Y, the maximum output that you can make of two goods using your resources fully and efficiently. So if I am, for example, making 40 of sort of good Y and 20 of sort of good X, and let's say if I move from point A to point B, I may need to sacrifice some of good Y, let's say 30. I go to 30 units, which means minus 10, which means I produce less of 10 units less of good Y, but that would be, let's say, giving me plus 10 of good X. Because I am already utilizing my resources fully and efficiently, whenever I move from point uh, on the PPC from one point or the other, let's say from A to B, there will always be a concept of what we call opportunity cost, which is what we call next best alternative forgone. And the reason is simply because already the resources are fully and efficiently employed. And anytime you want to make more of one good, the only way you can do that is by taking resources from some other good or from the production of some other good. Hence, D would be the right answer, which suggests that a movement along the PPC will result in opportunity cost in terms of more of X will lead to less of Y. The next question is also about PPC. It says the diagram shows the choices for an individual between leisure and earnings. The person decides to take a job that gives more leisure time. What is the opportunity cost to the individual of moving from point Y to point X? So let's see this. So right now you are at point Y, which means you are having $80 of earning and you are consuming 8 hours of leisure. And now you are moving from point Y to X, which would mean you are giving up $20 as you're moving to 60. So you're giving up $20 of earning. But because of that, losing out of $20 of earning, you are able to get 4 more hours of leisure. So the question says that what is the opportunity cost? What is the opportunity cost to the individual of moving from point Y to point X? So you can see this when you move from point Y to point X, this movement would result in you to lose out $20 for the 4 hours of work. So clearly the right answer would be A, which means you lose out $20 of earning to get 4 hours of leisure. In the next question, they say this that what is the best example of the existence of the economic problem? So, what is economic problem? Economic problem is basically scarcity, which means unlimited wants and limited resources. So, clearly, if you look at the answer choices, A says a government provides accommodation for all those who are homeless. Well, that is not an economic problem because economic problem should show something about scarcity. B says a police force has a lengthening list of unsolved crimes. This could be a possible answer, and the reason could be that if they have a lengthening sort of list of unsolved crimes, this means that they do not have enough resources to solve all the crimes, which means this is scarcity because they would then have to make choices in terms of choosing some cases and not all cases. C says Janita hands her homework in the last permitted deadline. Well, that doesn't really showing us any scarcity. And last says Musa completes his journey without putting petrol in his car. That doesn't really actually make sense as well. So the best answer is B, which is telling us that because of lack of resources, because of scarce resources, the police is unable to solve the all the crimes probably in a city. The next question says that a government taxes the production of cars. What is likely to decrease? So when the government is taxing any product, I want to show this in terms of a diagram. So if this is my demand and supply right now, okay, and if the government is saying that they will tax this good, they will put a tax to this good, the supply curve will shift backward from S0 to S1, and that would result in the price of the good to rise and the quantity demanded to fall. So in this case, what is likely to decrease? And the answer would be the supply of cars at every price, because when you put a tax on the good, the supply curve shifts backward. In question number 5, they say, which pair of economic institutions is most likely found in a market economy? So remember, what is a market economy? A market economy is one where there is no government intervention. There is no government, everything is decided through the market forces of demand supply. So there's only what we call private sector. So if you look at the answer choices, they say free accidents and emergency hospitals and charities. That may not be a feature of a market economy, because a market economy would have a private sector. So maybe this may not be the case. Partnership and public operations. Partnership does make sense, but public cooperation means this is government organizations. So this could not be the right answer. Stock exchange and monopolies could be true, because stock exchange is a market where firms' shares are listed, and monopolies can be found in a market economy if firms become too powerful. Trade union and local government schools. Again, local government schools will make this answer choice wrong. So the best answer is C, which basically says that stock exchange and monopolies can be found in a market economy. The next question says, developers want to increase the size of a major retail shopping area in a city. It is thought that the proposal would create hundreds of jobs, be profitable for the shops, but cause major traffic congestion. What economic concepts are directly involved in this statement? Well, one thing is for sure that this is a project which is causing major traffic congestion. So clearly, major traffic congestion would mean that there is external cost there. That external cost is happening primarily because of what we call uh, externality that it will cause because of this project. Then there is another thing that is happening is that the major retailing area would be profitable, and the profitability would mean that there is actually a private benefit as well. So the best answer for this one would be A, which says external cost and private benefit. But let's look at other answer choices just to make sure that we understand why others are wrong. Uh, the next one says income distribution and inelastic demand. Well, there is no reference of demand being inelastic, so that's one thing. The third one says that private investment and decrease in supply. Private investment does make sense because there's a major retailing shopping area. People would invest in this, but decrease in supply doesn't make sense. It might be an increase in supply for all that, for all we care. So D says that a social benefit and perfect competition. There is social cost rather than benefit. Yeah, there could be social benefit in terms of creation of jobs. Yes, but there is no mention of perfect competition. Perfect competition is when small firms are price takers, so there is no mention of that. So the best answer would be A in this case, where there is an external cost because of congestion, and there is private benefit in terms of jobs created, in terms of even like profitability. In this question number 7, the diagram shows the price of a product during the first and the second year, year 1 and year 2, and they're saying which changes in demand supply are consistent with the price behavior in year 2. So if you look at the question, in the second year, the price is going down, while in the first year, the price is going up. See, if you look at this, the price is going up and the second year price is going down. So we need to choose an answer from here where ultimately my price should fall. So let's look at each answer. The first choice is A says demand falls by 5% while supply fall by 10%. Well, if demand is falling by 5% and supply is also falling by 10%, so demand is falling by more than the fall, I'm sorry, demand is falling by less than the fall in supply. So if I want to sort of make the diagram for For this is how it would look like. So let's assume that right now the demand is D naught and supply is S naught. So demand falls by 5%. So demand goes from D naught to D1. Okay, and supply falls by 10%. So I'm going to make a larger fall in supply. So if the supply is falling by more than the fall in demand, you will see the price actually goes up. Does that make sense? So that's why A can't be the right answer. B says demand falls by 10% and supply falls by 5%. Well, this could be the right answer because when the demand falls by 10%, the price will fall. And when the supply falls by 5%, the price will rise. But because demand fall is greater than fall in supply, ultimately my price would actually fall. So in a diagram, we can show this like that. Let's say if this is my demand D naught, supply is S naught, let's say currently the price is P naught, and if the demand falls by much more, then the supply supply falls. So ultimately your price would be here. Ultimately your price will fall. So the key thing to remember is that if the demand is falling by more than the fall in supply, the price will go down. So B is the right answer. But let's quickly look at other answer choices. C says demand is unchanged, supply falls. When the supply falls, price will go up. So this can't be true. D says demand is rising, so price will go up. And supply is falling by 5%, so price will go down. Because we ultimately want the price to fall, we would not go for even D because D would result in ultimately price to go up. So the best answer for us is B, where the demand is falling by more than the fall in supply, making ultimately the price to fall. In question 8, it says a trade union agrees on a closed shop policy with employers in an industry. How does this operate? So, what is a closed shop? A closed shop basically is an agreement which an employer does with a trade union, where they say that anytime a new member comes or joins the company, and a new employee comes and joins the company, he has to basically make sure that he becomes a member of the trade union. In other words, all workers must be members of the trade union. There can't be any member or any sort of worker or employee who is working and not a member. So, by sort of agreement, everyone who works for the organization has to be the member of the trade union. So, A is the right answer. Question 9 says, when will a central bank act as the lender of last resort to a commercial bank? Well, central bank can help commercial bank when commercial banks are in trouble, when they need money and they are in what we call sometimes liquidity crisis. Liquidity crisis simply means that they do not have the money to meet their uh, consumer's requirement. And that's why A is the right answer. When some commercial bank is in crisis, in its liquidity crisis, it doesn't have the money to sort of meet the customer's need. That's when the commercial bank will decide to lend. In question 10, it says in the diagram D1 and S1 represent the demand for and supply of labor. W indicates the legal minimum wage, so this W is the legal minimum wage, and D1 and S1 is the supply for labor. An influx of migrants causes the supply to shift to the right. The new supply curve is S2. How many people will be employed if the minimum wage legislation is abolished? Is so if there is a minimum wage when demand and supply was D1 and S1, then wage would be W. But if you remove this minimum wage, then the wage will be determined through the market forces of demand supply. So given our new supply curve is now not S1 but S2, given S2 is our supply curve and given T1 is our demand curve, the equilibrium wage rate would be coming from this point here, and the number of people employed would be 7 million. Hence, if you look at the answer choices, how many people will be employed if the minimum wage legislation is then abolished? Then the answer would be 7 million, because with the new supply curve of S2 and the demand curve being D1, 7 million people will be employed. So D is the right answer. Question number 11 says the table shows how three people spend their income. Person X, person Y, and person Z is given, and they are spending in three categories, which is food, clothing, and housing, entertainment, and luxury goods. Now, the logic here is just that if you are a poor person or if you're not that rich, then your expenditure or proportional expenditure on food and clothing would be the most. So clearly, if I want to choose uh, the guy or the person with the lowest income, I may want to go for person Y for two reasons. Number one, he's spending a large proportion of his money on food and clothing, and number two, his expenditure on luxury goods is the lowest. So clearly, person Y must be the one with the lowest income. Now, then we need to look at what is happening with luxury goods. If we look at person Z and person X, they have a similar percentage of income spent on luxury goods. But when you go to food, clothing, and housing, person X is spending more than person Z, which would mean that may suggest that, in fact, even on entertainment, person Z is spending more, which means that person X might be poorer than person Z, because the amount or the percentage of income that he's spending on food, clothing is higher than person Z. So I'm going to go for uh, B as the right answer, which says that it's Y who's the poorest, then comes X, and then would be Z. Question 12 says, how does a firm guarantee that it makes the maximum profit? Well, profit is simply total revenue minus total cost. So, if we can maximize the difference between total revenue and total cost, that would be my profit. And that's why A is the right answer. Question 13 says two firms agree to integrate their activities. What must result? Integrate simply means that firms are coming together or joining. There are different kinds of integration. There could be a merger, or there could be an acquisition of two firms. And integration would result in basically change of ownership structure as firms either come together or one firm decides to buy another firm. And that's why A is the right answer, where two firms, when they integrate, there is a change in ownership structure. Question 14 says the table shows the unit of factors of production that a firm needs to employ for two different levels of output. What is the firm experiencing? So, in this question, what we look at is that you have been given land, labor, capital, three inputs, and output. And if you look at this, that if the input level was 6, 8, and 4, the output was 100. But if the input level changes to 6, 12, and 6, the output level becomes 200. So what we look at is, first of all, what's the rate at which output is changing. If you look at that, that will be 200 minus 100 over 100, new minus old over old, times 100. So that would be equal to 100%. There's a 100% increase in output. But if you look at inputs, inputs are not increasing by 100%. In fact, it's 9 minus 6 over 6 times 100, that would be 50%. And if you have find out the rate at which labor is also increased, that's also increasing by 50%, and so is your capital, which is also increasing by 50%, which means that all the inputs are increasing by 50%, and if the output is increasing by more than 50%, then we will have something called economies of scale. Economies of scale is where your long run average cost falls. And it happens if output rises faster than the rise in input, which is exactly what we see, that inputs are rising by 50%, but output is rising by 100%. Constant returns to scale would have been if input and output was increasing at the same sort of percentage, but external economies of scale can only happen when the industry is growing and not the firm is growing. So I'm going to sort of cancel these. So the right answer for this question is B. In question 15, it says that by 2014, government subsidies for the Chinese steel industry led to 200 million tons of excess output. The diagram shows the market for Chinese steel, which would represent the position before the subsidy but after the market adjusted. So in other words, we want to see a diagram where the subsidy is imposed, but the new price is not uh, adjusted. So whenever we give a subsidy, we know this, that the supply curve will shift to the right. So the first thing is that we will look for our answer choices where we see supply curve shift to the right because subsidy results in the supply curve to shift to the right. So if you look at the answer choices, A and B do not make sense because in A and B the supply curve is not shifting. Remember, this is demand and supply, so the supply curve is not shifting in these options. Let's look at C and D now. If you look at C and D, the supply curve is shifting. In fact, this could be my supply curve S0 versus S1, and similarly this could be supply curve S0 versus S1. And in both of these answer choices, supply curve is shifting. But next thing we're going to look at, the question is saying that we need to look for an excess of 200 million tons of output. So if I go back to my answer choices, in C, if this was my equilibrium price before, if P naught was my equilibrium price before, I could see that the gap between the output right now versus before the adjustment output, the gap is of 200. But in this case, if my price was P naught, given D naught is my demand curve, then because of the subsidy and before the adjustment of the market, the gap is 400 minus 100 or 300. So if we're looking for an excess output of 200, the right answer for us would be C, where before the new price comes into place, there is an extra or surplus of 200. In the next question, it says the government wishes to stimulate economic recovery. Which actions will assist this? Well, if the government wants to sort of increase sort of economic recovery, there are two ways they can go about it. Either they can make the aggregate demand of the economy go up, or can make the aggregate supply of the economy to go up. And in order to make the aggregate demand of the economy go up, they may need to sort of spend more on sort of investment, and that's why decreasing government spending would not be the right option. Decreasing income tax would be the right option because if the income tax goes down, then consumers will consume more. Firms may also want to sort of invest more because they are now taxed less, and as a result of that, AD curve may shift to the right. So B could be the right answer. But let's also see why C and D are wrong. Increasing interest rate will actually be wrong because that may result in the cost of borrowing to rise. It becomes expensive to sort of borrow. Investment may fall, so AD would fall, aggregate demand would fall. Similarly, increasing indirect taxation may not be a good policy because that would mean you make it costly for people to buy goods. So the best answer for us is B, where decreasing income tax may cause your aggregate demand to rise and basically result in economic recovery. Question 70 says the government fixes the rate of income tax at zero point 0.2 per dollar earned. What describes this type of taxation? Point 0.2 per dollar earned would mean basically it's a 20% tax, and it's a 20% flat tax. So if it's a 20% flat tax, this would mean it is proportional in nature. A progressive tax would have been one where the rate actually rises when income rises. So because the rate is, so let me write this, rate rises as uh, Y for income, income rises. So that would have been progressive. Proportional is when the rate stays the same as income rises, which is exactly what is happening here. And regressive is when the rate actually falls as income rises. So clearly C is the right answer. Question 18 says the government introduces a law to reduce the restrictive practices of trade union. What would be the most likely purpose of this law? If the government is trying to sort of restrict the power of trade unions, they may want trade unions to not affect sort of labor wages, or they may want to sort of increase um competition in labor market, that is allowing the market forces of demand and supply to operate more freely. And that's why C is the right answer. But let's look at other options as well. In A, it says to change from a mixed to a planned economy. Well, if you want to go from a mixed to a planned economy, you would rather want government intervention and no private sector, which is something which is not suggested here. So A can't be the right answer. B says to ensure a fairer distribution of income. Well, if you want to have a fairer distribution of income, then the way we go about is by using policies of taxation rather than curbing the power of trade union. And D says to reduce government expenditure on job training. Uh, if you want to see that, trade union sort of control may not be the option. So C seems to be the best answer, where the government may be trying to improve more competition in the labor market and may want to sort of not make the trade unions that powerful. Question 19 says the table shows the government's received from taxation. What is the total amount of revenue raised by indirect taxes? So let's quickly see which of these are indirect taxes. A, passenger duty is definitely indirect taxes. Company profit tax is actually an income tax. It's an income tax on profit. So that won't be included as an indirect tax. In fact, that's a direct tax. Import duty is another indirect tax. Income tax would be definitely a direct tax, so we won't include that. And inheritance tax is also what we call a direct tax. So, sales tax, import duty, and air passenger duties are all examples of what we say indirect tax. So if we add 300 plus 75 plus 80 plus 10, we would have C, which is 385, the right answer, as that's the sum of all the indirect taxes. Question 20 says, what would best indicate the start of an economic boom? In an economic boom, basically, we have what we call rising output and rising employment. There are there is a rise of AD curve. There is more sort of demand for goods and services, and as a result of that, there will be more people employed. And so C would be the best answer, where rising levels of employment could be resulting from rising demand for goods and services. Another answer, which could be a possible answer, could be B, rising interest rate, because when economic boom is happening, there would be more demand for sort of loans. But more importantly, C would make more sense. There is a rise in employment. Question number 21 says a country has a very high GDP and a small population but has a low standard of living. What may be the cause of this low standard of living? Well, if the country has a very high GDP but a small population, we should ideally believe that the standard of living must be high. The only reason why it could not be high could be because of what we say high inequality of income distribution. If a lot of people have uh, less income, or if the income is distributed in an unequal manner, then there will be a problem of what we call uh, lower standard of living. At the same time, if there is a limited provision of merit goods, which means that healthcare and education is not given to everyone, that would mean that there would be what we call lower standard of living. And that's why B is the best answer, where not only we have high income inequality, but also a very low amount of merit goods like public healthcare or education given to people, and that may be causing a lower standard of living. Question 22 says, the table gives information about three economic indicators in four countries. What may be concluded from this information? Now, whenever there's a table question, the best way to go about it is that we read answer choices and then eliminate. Rather than analyzing the table from before, it's better to analyze the table with each answer choice. So let's read A. Countries with higher inflation have higher interest rates. So let's see that. Uh, the countries with higher inflation would be, for example, country X and country Y. And when you look at the interest rates, they also have the higher interest rate. So A could be possibly a right answer. I'm going to go for A. Let's see other answer choices. B says countries with high interest rates have low unemployment, but there seems to be also the countries with high unemployment. So B can't be true. C says the country with the lowest inflation had the highest unemployment. The lowest inflation was with country W, but country W has the does not have the highest unemployment. So again, this goes wrong. And D says the country with the lowest unemployment had the lowest inflation. Lowest unemployment was happening at for country Z, and they do not have the lowest inflation. In fact, lowest inflation was with country W. So A is the right answer. All of the statements are wrong. Question 23 says the weight for a product in the consumer price index was increased. What is most likely to have caused this adjustment? So, what are weights? Weights are basically the percentages given to to different goods according to the proportion of income that is spent on those goods. So when we are calculating inflation, if some goods take up larger proportion of our income, or if consumer is spending more on those goods, then we would give those goods more weight in order to give them more importance in the calculation of inflation. Because if the price of, let's say, a good which takes up almost 40% of your income, for example, let's say housing rent goes up, then that can impact inflation much more than, let's say, a good which is not that important. So you will give a higher weight to that good which takes up a larger proportion of your income. And that's why D is the right answer, which says that the product has taken a bigger share of consumers' income, which means a larger percentage of the income is now spent on that good. Question 24 says China is classified as a developing country. Recently, contribution to its GDP were agriculture 10%, construction 13%, manufacturing 32%, and services 45%. Which contribution to GDP usually decreases first when countries move to a higher level of development? When countries move to a higher level of development, something which happens is that a lot of people would then be employed to manufacturing and services sector. But what is important to note is this, that the importance of agriculture sector will start to fall, and that's why A is the right answer. If you look at rich countries, they would hardly have any contribution to GDP from agriculture sector. But if you look at poor countries like Pakistan, would have a significant part of the income coming from the agriculture sector. So that's why A is the right answer. Number 25 says some people think that the debts and interest payments of the poorest countries in the world should be cancelled. What might be a disadvantage for the poorest countries if this was done? Well, one way to look at it is that it's good if the debt and the interest payments of the poorest countries are forgiven, are cancelled, that they don't no longer need to pay those loans, and this will help them in terms of using the same money for some other projects. But the downside of this is that in the future, if they plan to raise money or loans from anyone, no one will be willing to give it to them primarily because they have a reputation of not giving the money back. So the right answer would be A. International banks might be less willing to give loans to poor countries because they would feel that if this money was given, the poor countries may not return and these loans will also get cancelled or forgiven. Hence, A is the right answer. Question 26 is, which country is likely to have the highest standard of living? If a country has a higher standard of living, the one thing is for sure that the life expectancy for such a country should be very high. So clearly, C and D, life expectancy, which means how long people live, should be very high. So I'm going to go for C and D. Between C and D, if we look at it, the birth rates are also same. On the other hand, the death rate for country D is better, and even infant mortality rate is better. Having a lower infant mortality rate would mean that the survival of kids is longer in country D. Hence, D is the right answer for this question. For question number 27, it says, what might cause the balance on the current account of the Mauritius to improve? Uh, so current account may include exports and imports of goods and services. So let's read each answer choice. A says increased purchases of coffee from Kenya. If a lot more coffee is being bought from abroad, then your imports of coffee is increasing. Your current account may worsen. Increased transport of Mauritian goods in Greek ship. So if the Mauritian producers are using Greek ships, then that will result in the imports of services to increase because now we're using Greek ships to sell these goods and services or in transport these goods and services to other countries. Increased spending by Mauritians on holidays in South Africa is also regarded as imports of services, so even C would be wrong. Increased spending by tourists in Mauritian hotels would be the right answer. That would be more services bought by foreigners in Mauritian hotels, so D would be the right answer. That would result in current account to improve. Question 28 says, a country says that it wishes to increase its trade protection policies. What might this involve? So if you want to increase the trade protection policies, then you are basically reducing the amount of value of imports in the country or improving the amount of exports in the country. And in that case, C would be the right answer, which says increase self-sufficiency and increase tariffs. Self-sufficiency will go up, and that would mean we are not importing many goods. An increased tariff would also result in putting a tax on imported goods, which will result in less of the goods to be imported. All other answer choices are more about domestic trade rather than foreign trade. For example, price control and increased regulation in domestic monopoly industry doesn't talk about anything about imports. Eliminating waste in the use of resources. This B option doesn't talk about basically again how imports will improve, and similarly A doesn't talk about how imports will improve. So the right answer is C, which will result in the imports to improve. In question 29, it says, it has been suggested that all countries producing arms should ban the exports of weapon and cut production in order to reduce the risk of war. What would happen if this occurred? So if you are trying to sort of reduce the export of weapons, which means that we are no longer selling the weapons abroad, and we're also cutting down the production of these arms and guns to reduce the risk of war, then we will cause something sort of drastic for the industries that are producing weapons or producers that are producing weapons. And hence, if you look at C, C says there would be a risk of structural unemployment, which means that there would be a long-term fall in demand, which will cause the unemployment to occur. And at the same time, major producers of the weapon will suffer. So there would be a risk of structural unemployment in countries that are major producers of weapons. They will lose out because now it was going to be a long-term fall of demand. So the best answer would be C. B says the price of existing weapons would fall. And the answer is that existing weapons are already sold, so maybe we may not be able to say that would happen. But it could also be possible if the supply is going down because of now production is affected. One would argue that probably the price of existing weapons may actually rise. Hence, C is the right answer. Question 30 says the US currently trades in oil with the UK. The discovery of new oil and gas deposits in the US will mean that its import decrease and its oil export increase. From the initial equilibrium at point X, which letter indicates the new equilibrium point for the US exchange rate? If the US is now importing less oil because there's a discovery of new oil, so that results in less oil to be imported, which means that the supply will actually fall because now we do not require foreign currency anymore to buy oil, and hence the supply of dollar in the market will fall. So if I am right now at D and X, which is this X equilibrium, I will now have a supply to fall and I'm going to move to S1. But at the same time, if you look at it, that they said that the discovery of oil will mean that its oil imports will fall, but the exports will rise. And for exports to rise, that would mean a lot more people would be interested in buying US oil, which means demand for the currency will also rise. And that both together would mean we would go for B, where demand will rise for the currency because of a rise in exports, and supply would fall because of a fall in imports, and the equilibrium would be at B, so B is the right answer.